In the opulent drawing rooms of Regency England, where bloodlines determined destiny and a single misstep could destroy a reputation forever, Lady Catherine Whitmore never imagined that a simple observation about jewellery would unravel the very foundations of her world. What began as polite conversation at a grand estate would expose secrets buried for decades, challenging everything she believed about her noble heritage and setting in motion events that would forever change the course of her life. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has travelled. The morning mist clung to the manicured gardens of Whitmore Hall like silk veils, creating an ethereal backdrop for what should have been the most anticipated day in Lady Catherine Whitmore's 22 years of carefully orchestrated existence. Standing before her bedroom's tall windows, she watched the groundskeepers prepare the estate for the evening's grand ball, where her engagement to the Duke of Ravenshollow would be formally announced to London's most distinguished society. Catherine's reflection in the glass revealed a young woman of striking beauty, with auburn hair that caught the morning light like burnished copper, and emerald eyes that held depths her sheltered upbringing had never allowed her to explore. Her porcelain complexion, unmarked by worry or hardship, spoke of a life lived within the protective walls of privilege. Yet beneath that serene exterior, a restlessness stirred that she dared not voice aloud. "Miss Catherine, your mother requests your presence in the morning room," announced her lady's maid, Sarah, whose gentle Yorkshire accent provided one of the few authentic connections Catherine had to the world beyond her gilded existence. The morning room, bathed in golden sunlight, served as the nerve centre of Lady Margaret Whitmore's social empire. Catherine's mother, an elegant woman whose steel will was disguised by delicate features and impeccable manners, stood reviewing the evening's arrangements with military precision. Every detail, from the placement of the Venetian crystal chandeliers to the selection of French champagne, had been orchestrated to showcase the Whitmore family's impeccable taste and substantial fortune. "Catherine, darling," Lady Margaret said without looking up from her correspondence, "I trust you've been practicing your curtsy for His Grace. Tonight's announcement will be reported in every society paper from London to Edinburgh. We cannot afford even the slightest impropriety." Lee, the Duke of Ravenshollow, Sterling Blackwood, represented everything Catherine had been taught to desire in a husband. His lineage traced back to the Norman conquest. His estates sprawled across 3 counties, and his influence in Parliament was considerable. At 35, he possessed the distinguished bearing of a man accustomed to deference, with sharp features that spoke of aristocratic breeding and dark eyes that seemed to catalogue everything around him with calculating precision. Catherine had met Sterling only 6 times during their formal courtship, each encounter carefully chaperoned and structured around predetermined activities. Their conversations had been pleasant enough, touching on safe topics like literature, music, and the weather. Yet something in his manner, a subtle condescension in his tone, the way his gaze seemed to assess her like a prized mare at auction, left her feeling more like a commodity than a cherished bride-to-be. "Mother," Catherine ventured carefully, "might I ask what you know of His Grace's family history? I realize it's presumptuous, but I find myself curious about the traditions I'll be joining." Lady Margaret's pen paused mid-sentence. "What an odd question, Catherine. The Blackwood lineage is impeccable, as you well know. His Grace's great-grandfather served as advisor to King George III, and the family has maintained their position through careful stewardship of their holdings and advantageous marriages." "Of course, Mother. I simply wondered about more personal details. Family heirlooms, perhaps, or cherished traditions that might help me better understand my future role." "Nay," a fleeting expression crossed Lady Margaret's face, too quick for Catherine to interpret fully, but it carried an undertone of something that might have been anxiety. "Such matters will be revealed in due time, my dear. Your focus should remain on conducting yourself with the grace and dignity befitting your station. As the day progressed, Catherine found herself increasingly restless. The weight of her future pressed upon her like a heavy cloak, each hour bringing her closer to a destiny she had never chosen, but had always accepted as inevitable. Her education had been designed to create the perfect aristocratic wife. She spoke French and Italian fluently, played the pianoforte with skill, painted watercolors with delicate precision, and could manage a household staff with quiet authority. Yet in quiet moments, when she walked alone through the estate's ancient oak groves or sat in the library surrounded by volumes she was discouraged from reading too deeply, Catherine felt the stirring of something unnamed, a longing for experiences beyond the prescribed boundaries of her world, for conversations that challenged rather than merely entertained, for a life that felt authentically her own. The afternoon brought a flurry of preparations as London's elite began arriving for the evening's festivities. Catherine watched from her window as carriages bearing the crests of England's most powerful families rolled up the circular drive. Each arrival represented another witness to her transformation from Lady Catherine Whitmore into the future Duchess of Ravenshollow, a role that felt as foreign to her as if she were donning a costume for a theatrical performance. As twilight approached and Catherine prepared for the evening that would seal her fate, she caught sight of her reflection once more in the mirror. The young woman looking back at her wore an expression of resigned acceptance, but in the depths of her emerald eyes, a spark of something indefinable flickered, a hint that perhaps this perfectly orchestrated evening might not unfold exactly as planned. What Catherine could not have imagined was that a simple observation about a piece of jewelry would soon shatter the carefully constructed world around her, revealing secrets that would force her to question everything she had ever believed about her family, her future, and herself. The golden cage that had protected her for 22 years was about to be unlocked, and what lay beyond its confines would prove far more extraordinary than anything her sheltered existence had prepared her to imagine. The grand ballroom of Whitmore Hall had been transformed into a glittering testament to aristocratic splendor. 3 magnificent crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with ancestral portraits, while hundreds of candles flickered in silver sconces, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that spoke to centuries of accumulated wealth and influence. The finest musicians from London's Royal Opera House provided a melodious backdrop as England's most distinguished families gathered to witness what society papers had already proclaimed the engagement of the season. Catherine descended the marble staircase with practiced grace, her emerald silk gown, chosen specifically to complement her eyes, flowing behind her like liquid starlight. The bodice, adorned with seed pearls and delicate silver embroidery, had been crafted by London's most sought-after modiste, while her grandmother's diamond necklace caught the candlelight with every breath. Yet despite her flawless appearance, Catherine felt as though she were watching herself from a great distance, a player in an elaborate theatrical production where she had memorized her lines but never truly understood her character's motivations. The Duke of Ravenshollow stood near the fireplace, resplendent in his formal evening attire, accepting congratulations from a circle of admirers with the confident bearing of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, and his family's ancient signet ring, a heavy gold band bearing the Blackwood crest, caught the firelight as he gestured during conversation. "Catherine, my dear," Sterling said as she approached, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eton and Oxford, "you look absolutely radiant this evening. I trust you're prepared for our announcement." "Of course, Your Grace," Catherine replied, offering the demure smile she had perfected through years of social training. "I am honored to be joining such a distinguished family." As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself swept into a carefully choreographed dance of social interactions. She curtsied to dowagers whose approval could make or break a reputation, exchanged pleasantries with young ladies whose envy was barely concealed behind painted smiles, and accepted congratulations from gentlemen whose calculating gazes suggested they were already assessing the political advantages of aligning themselves with the future Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow. It was during a brief respite from the receiving line that Catherine noticed an elderly woman standing somewhat apart from the main gathering. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the Dowager Countess of Pemberton, was known throughout society for her sharp wit, her extensive travels, and her complete disregard for conventional social boundaries. At 73, she possessed the kind of confidence that came from having outlived most of her critics and accumulated enough scandalous stories to fill several volumes of memoirs. "Lady Ashworth," Catherine said, approaching with genuine curiosity, "how wonderful to see you this evening. I understand you've recently returned from the continent." "Indeed, my dear child," Lady Ashworth replied, her keen blue eyes studying Catherine with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly unsettling. "I've spent the past 6 months in Vienna, where the music is divine and the gossip even more so. But tell me, how are you feeling about this momentous evening?" There was something in the older woman's tone that suggested she was asking about more than mere social pleasantries. Catherine found herself responding with unusual honesty. "I confess, Lady Ashworth, that I feel rather like a ship about to embark on a voyage to unknown waters. One hopes for fair winds, but cannot entirely predict what lies ahead." Lady Ashworth's eyebrows rose with apparent approval. "A remarkably honest answer, my dear. Most young ladies in your position would have offered some rehearsed sentiment about joy and anticipation." She paused, her gaze drifting to where Sterling stood, holding court near the fireplace. "I notice His Grace wears the Blackwood signet ring this evening. Quite an impressive piece. The craftsmanship appears to be from the last century." Catherine followed her gaze, observing the heavy gold ring that Sterling wore with such obvious pride. "Yes, it's quite striking. A family heirloom, I believe." "How fascinating," Lady Ashworth murmured, though something in her expression suggested more than casual interest. "You know, my dear, I have quite an extensive collection of jewellery from my travels, and I've developed something of an eye for unique pieces. That particular ring, well, it reminds me of something I have seen before." Before Catherine could respond, the musicians struck up the opening notes of a waltz, and Sterling appeared at her elbow with the punctuality of a man accustomed to having his schedule respected without question. "Lady Catherine," he said, offering his arm with formal precision, "I believe our first dance as an engaged couple awaits." As they moved onto the dance floor, Catherine felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them. The other dancers gradually cleared a space, creating an intimate stage where their performance would be scrutinized and discussed for weeks to come. Sterling was an accomplished dancer, leading her through the intricate steps with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his ability to command any situation. "You seem somewhat distracted this evening," Sterling observed as they turned through a particularly complex sequence. "I trust you're not having second thoughts about our arrangement?" The word arrangement struck Catherine as oddly clinical, though she supposed it accurately described their engagement. "Not at all, Your Grace. I was simply admiring the beauty of the evening and reflecting on the significance of the moment. Excellent. I should hate for there to be any complications at this stage. The announcement has already been prepared for tomorrow's papers, and my solicitors have finalized the marriage settlements with your father. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned." As the waltz concluded and the assembled guests applauded politely, Catherine found herself wondering when her life had become something that proceeded exactly as planned by others. The thought was interrupted by the arrival of her younger sister, Lady Victoria Whitmore, whose beauty was perhaps even more striking than Catherine's own, though it carried an edge of ambition that their elder sister had never possessed. "Catherine, darling," Victoria said, her voice carrying a sweetness that didn't quite reach her eyes, "you look absolutely lovely this evening." "And your Grace," she continued, turning to Sterling with a curtsy that lingered just a moment longer than propriety demanded, "how distinguished you appear. That ring is particularly magnificent. I don't believe I've ever seen anything quite like it." Sterling's chest swelled with obvious pride. "It's been in my family for generations, Lady Victoria. The Blackwood crest was designed during the reign of Queen Anne, and this particular ring was crafted by the finest goldsmiths in London." "How remarkable," Victoria replied, though Catherine detected something calculating in her sister's expression. "You know, it's the most extraordinary coincidence, but our dear mother has a ring that bears a striking resemblance to yours. The design is so similar that one might almost think they were crafted by the same artisan." The words hung in the air, like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious symphony. Catherine felt a strange chill run down her spine, though she couldn't immediately understand why Victoria's observation should cause such unease. Sterling's expression, however, underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation, his confident smile faltering for just a moment before reasserting itself with what seemed like deliberate effort. "I'm certain you must be mistaken, Lady Victoria," Sterling said, his voice carrying a slight edge that hadn't been present moments before. "The Blackwood signet is unique, commissioned specifically for my family. Any resemblance to other pieces would be purely coincidental." But Victoria, perhaps emboldened by the attention she was receiving, or driven by some motivation Catherine couldn't fathom, pressed forward with the persistence of a terrier pursuing a particularly interesting scent. "Oh, but I'm quite certain of what I've seen," Victoria insisted, her voice rising just enough to attract the attention of nearby guests. "Mother keeps it in her private jewellery collection, and I've always admired its distinctive design. The crest is remarkably similar, almost identical, one might say." Catherine watched in growing alarm as more guests began to take notice of their conversation. Lady Ashworth had moved closer, her sharp eyes fixed on Sterling's face with the intensity of a hawk observing its prey. Other members of society's inner circle were beginning to form a loose circle around them, drawn by the subtle tension that was beginning to permeate the air like smoke from a distant fire. "Victoria," Catherine said quietly, attempting to redirect the conversation. "Perhaps we should actually," Victoria continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing attention or perhaps thriving on it. "I believe Mother mentioned that her ring has quite an interesting history. Something about it being a gift from a dear friend many years ago, before her marriage to Father." The colour drained from Sterling's face so completely that Catherine feared he might actually faint. The transformation was so dramatic that several guests gasped audibly, and the conversations around them began to fade as more people turned to observe the unfolding drama. "That's quite impossible," Sterling said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation that was entirely at odds with his usual commanding presence. "You must be confused, Lady Victoria. Perhaps the lighting is playing tricks on your memory." But Lady Ashworth, who had been observing the exchange with growing interest, suddenly stepped forward with the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of high society. "How curious," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and I must say, it brings to mind a most intriguing story I heard during my recent travels. Something about a certain gentleman who was known to have, shall we say, distributed rather generous gifts to various ladies of his acquaintance." The silence that followed was so complete that Catherine could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Sterling's face had gone from pale to ashen, and his hands were trembling so violently that the candlelight reflecting off his ring created dancing shadows on the wall behind him. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're implying," Sterling said, though his voice lacked any conviction. Lady Ashworth smiled with the satisfaction of a cat who had cornered a particularly plump mouse. "Oh, I think you understand perfectly well, Your Grace. The question is whether you're prepared to explain to this charming gathering exactly how your family's unique signet ring came to be replicated in the jewelry collection of your future mother-in-law." The ballroom erupted in a cacophony of whispered conversations as the implications of Lady Ashworth's words began to sink in. Catherine felt as though the floor beneath her feet had suddenly become unstable, as if the very foundations of her world were shifting in ways she couldn't comprehend. Sterling looked around the room like a trapped animal, his gaze darting from face to face as he searched for some escape from the web of implications that was rapidly tightening around him. When his eyes finally met Catherine's, she saw something there that chilled her to the bone. Not love, not even affection, but calculation and a growing sense of panic. "This is preposterous," Sterling declared, his voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. "I will not stand here and be subjected to these insinuations based on the confused recollections of a young woman who clearly doesn't understand what she's saying." But Victoria, perhaps sensing that she had stumbled onto something far more significant than she had initially realized, pressed her advantage with the ruthless instinct of someone who had spent her entire life competing for attention and advantage. "Confused," Victoria repeated, her voice carrying a note of injured innocence that was perfectly calculated to inflame the situation further. "I assure you, Your Grace, that my memory is quite clear. Perhaps we should ask Mother to join us and bring her ring so that we might compare them directly." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge that could not be ignored. Catherine watched in horror as Sterling's composure finally cracked completely, his mask of aristocratic dignity falling away to reveal something desperate and cornered beneath. "That won't be necessary," Sterling said, his voice now carrying a tone of cold finality that sent shivers down Catherine's spine. "I find that I am no longer comfortable with this arrangement. Lady Catherine, I'm afraid I must withdraw my offer of marriage." "Nah," the words hit Catherine like a physical blow, though she realized with surprise that the pain came not from heartbreak, but from the public humiliation of being rejected in front of London's most influential society members. The gasps and murmurs that erupted around them seemed to come from a great distance, as if she were hearing them through water. "Sterling," she whispered, using his given name for the first time, "surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly what I've said," Sterling replied, his voice now carrying a cruelty that she had never suspected he possessed. "I cannot, in good conscience, align myself with a family whose connections as might prove embarrassing to the Blackwood name." With that devastating pronouncement, Sterling turned on his heel and strode from the ballroom, leaving Catherine standing alone in the center of a circle of shocked guests, her emerald gown suddenly feeling like a costume from a play that had ended far too abruptly. The silence that followed his departure was broken only by the sound of Catherine's own breathing and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, some sympathetic, some curious, some barely concealing their satisfaction at witnessing such a spectacular fall from grace, and realized that her carefully orchestrated life had just collapsed as completely and publicly as any structure ever could. What secrets lay hidden in her mother's jewelry collection, and how would this devastating revelation reshape not only her future, but her understanding of her family's past? The morning after the catastrophic ball dawned grey and drizzling, as if the very heavens were weeping for Catherine's shattered prospects. She had not slept, instead spending the long hours until sunrise, sitting by her bedroom window, watching the last carriages depart into the darkness, carrying with them the witnesses to her public humiliation. By dawn, the story would be racing through London's drawing rooms faster than the Morning Post, each retelling no doubt embellished with additional speculation about the mysterious connection between the Blackwood signet and Lady Margaret's hidden jewellery. Catherine's mother had retreated to her private chambers immediately following Sterling's dramatic departure, claiming a sudden onset of vapours that required complete solitude. Lord Whitmore, Catherine's father, had spent the remainder of the evening in his study with a bottle of brandy and a succession of increasingly agitated visitors, family solicitors, business associates, and political allies, all seeking to understand how the evening's events might affect their various interests and investments. Victoria, meanwhile, seemed to oscillate between genuine remorse for her role in the disaster and a barely concealed excitement at finding herself at the center of such momentous events. She had attempted several times to speak with Catherine, but her elder sister found herself unable to bear even the sight of the person whose innocent observation had triggered such devastating consequences. "Miss Catherine," Sarah said softly, entering with a breakfast tray that Catherine knew she would not touch, "your father requests your presence in his study when you feel able to receive him." Catherine nodded wordlessly, though the prospect of facing her father's disappointment felt almost as daunting as the previous evening's public rejection. Lord Whitmore had invested considerable political and financial capital in securing the Ravens Hollow alliance, and its sudden dissolution would have ramifications far beyond Catherine's personal heartbreak. The study, with its dark wood panelling and leather-bound volumes, had always served as the masculine heart of Whitmore Hall. Here, generations of Catherine's ancestors had made the decisions that shaped their family's destiny, and the weight of that history seemed to press down upon her as she entered to find her father standing before the window, his usually impeccable appearance dishevelled from a sleepless night. "Catherine," Lord Whitmore said without turning around, his voice carrying a weariness that aged him beyond his 53 years. "I trust you understand the gravity of our situation." "Yes, father," Catherine replied, though she suspected her understanding was still incomplete. "I am deeply sorry for the embarrassment I have caused our family." Lord Whitmore finally turned to face her, and Catherine was shocked to see how much he seemed to have aged in a single night. His usually sharp eyes were bloodshot, his silver hair dishevelled, and his shoulders carried a burden that seemed to have materialized overnight. "The embarrassment, my dear, is the least of our concerns," he said with a bitter laugh. "Sterling's withdrawal has created complications that extend far beyond social standing. The marriage settlements included provisions that are now in jeopardy, and certain business arrangements that depended upon the Blackwood connection are suddenly uncertain." Catherine felt a chill of understanding. Her engagement had never been merely a romantic arrangement. It had been a carefully constructed business alliance designed to benefit both families' interests. Her personal feelings had been irrelevant from the beginning, a realization that should have been liberating but instead felt like another layer of betrayal. "What would you have me do, father?" Catherine asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "For now, nothing," Lord Whitmore replied. "Your mother and I have decided that a period of discretion would be advisable. We've arranged for you to spend some time with your great-aunt Agatha in Bath. The waters there are said to be beneficial for one's constitution, and the society is somewhat less intense than what we encounter in London." Aunt Agatha. Catherine had not seen her father's aunt in nearly 3 years, but she remembered her as a formidable woman who had scandalized society by remaining unmarried well into her 40s before finally accepting a proposal from a distinguished scholar who shared her passion for ancient history and modern literature. Their marriage had been brief but reportedly blissful, ending with Professor Ashford's death from fever during an archaeological expedition to Egypt. Rather than retreating into conventional widowhood, Aunt Agatha had used her inheritance to establish herself as one of Bath's most influential intellectual hostesses. "When am I to depart?" Catherine asked, recognizing that this was not truly a request, but a carefully disguised command. "Tomorrow morning," Lord Whitmore replied. "The arrangements have already been made. Sarah will accompany you, and we've sent word ahead to prepare Aunt Agatha for your arrival." The journey to Bath took the better part of 2 days, travelling in the family's second-best carriage to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. Catherine spent the hours watching the countryside roll past, noting how the landscape seemed to change as they moved away from London's sphere of influence. The rigid formality of the capital gave way to rolling hills dotted with sheep, market towns where merchants hawked their wares with cheerful enthusiasm, and coaching inns where travellers from all walks of life mingled with an easy familiarity that would have been impossible in London's stratified society. Bath itself proved to be a revelation. Unlike London's imposing grandeur, the city possessed an elegant intimacy, its honey-coloured stone buildings arranged around graceful crescents and squares that seemed designed for human comfort rather than intimidation. The famous Roman baths drew visitors from across Europe, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere where intellectual curiosity was valued as highly as noble birth. Aunt Agatha's residence on the Royal Crescent commanded a spectacular view of the surrounding countryside, while maintaining the perfect balance between comfort and sophistication. The house itself reflected its owner's eclectic interests. Classical sculptures shared space with modern paintings, ancient texts sat alongside contemporary novels, and scientific instruments occupied places of honor alongside family portraits. "Catherine, my dear child," Aunt Agatha said as she greeted her great-niece in the elegant entrance hall. At 68, Agatha Ashford possessed the kind of timeless beauty that came from intelligence, curiosity, and a complete disregard for society's expectations about how widows should behave. Her silver hair was arranged in a fashionable but practical style, her clothing was well made but comfortable, and her eyes sparkled with the vitality of someone who had never stopped learning. "Aunt Agatha," Catherine replied, finding herself unexpectedly emotional as she embraced this woman who represented everything she had been taught to avoid: independence, intellectual pursuit, and the courage to live life on one's own terms. "Come," Aunt Agatha said, linking her arm through Catherine's with easy affection. "We have much to discuss, and I suspect you have questions that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that brought you here." The drawing room where Aunt Agatha received her guests was unlike any space Catherine had ever encountered. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, but they showed clear signs of being read rather than merely displayed. Comfortable chairs were arranged to encourage conversation, and the tables held an eclectic collection of objects: fossils, pressed flowers, correspondence from scholars across Europe, and manuscripts in various stages of completion. "I've heard something of your recent difficulties," Aunt Agatha said, as they settled into chairs beside a window overlooking the garden. "Though I suspect the full story is considerably more complex than what the gossips have managed to piece together." Catherine found herself pouring out the entire tale: the arranged engagement, her growing unease about Sterling's character, Victoria's seemingly innocent observation about their mother's ring, and the devastating public rejection that had followed. As she spoke, she watched Aunt Agatha's expression carefully, noting how her great-aunt's eyes sharpened with interest at certain details while remaining compassionately understanding throughout. "And what do you make of this mysterious ring that seems to have caused such consternation?" Aunt Agatha asked when Catherine had finished her account. "I confess I don't understand it at all," Catherine replied. "Mother has refused to discuss the matter, and Father seems more concerned with the financial implications than with uncovering the truth." Aunt Agatha was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the garden where early spring flowers were beginning to bloom despite the recent rain. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a thoughtfulness that suggested she was choosing her words with particular care. "Catherine, my dear, there are aspects of your family's history that you may not fully understand. Your mother, before her marriage to your father, was, shall we say, the young woman of considerable beauty and spirit who attracted attention from many quarters. Not all of that attention was entirely appropriate, and not all of the gentlemen involved were entirely honourable in their intentions." Catherine felt a flutter of understanding, though the full implications remained unclear. "Are you suggesting that Mother's ring might have been a gift from someone other than Father?" "I'm suggesting," Aunt Agatha said carefully, "that your mother's past may contain complexities that could explain Sterling's rather dramatic reaction to your sister's observation." But more importantly, I'm suggesting that this crisis, devastating though it may seem, might actually represent an opportunity for you to discover who you truly are when freed from the expectations that have shaped your life thus far. Over the following days, Catherine found herself gradually adapting to the rhythm of life in Bath. Aunt Agatha's social circle proved to be unlike anything she had encountered in London. Scholars, artists, writers, and independent women who had carved out lives of purpose and meaning beyond the traditional boundaries of marriage and motherhood. The conversations at Aunt Agatha's dinner parties ranged from archaeological discoveries in Greece to the latest developments in natural philosophy, from poetry and literature to political reform and social justice. It was at one such gathering that Catherine first encountered Dr. Elias Reed, a physician and natural philosopher who had recently returned from several years studying medicine in Edinburgh and Vienna. Unlike the polished aristocrats of her London acquaintance, Dr. Reed possessed an earnest intensity that spoke of genuine passion for his work and a complete disregard for the social hierarchies that had governed Catherine's entire existence. "Lady Catherine, Doctor," Reed said when Aunt Agatha introduced them, "I understand you've recently arrived from London. I hope you're finding Bath's intellectual climate a refreshing change from the capital's more conventional pursuits." There was something in his manner, a directness combined with genuine respect, that immediately set Catherine at ease. Doctor Reed was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that showed a tendency to curl despite his attempts to tame it. Intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see beyond surface appearances, and hands that spoke of both scholarly study and practical work. "I confess I'm still adjusting to the differences," Catherine replied honestly. "In London, conversations tend to focus on who one knows rather than what one thinks." Dr. Reed's smile transformed his serious features, revealing a warmth that Catherine found unexpectedly appealing. "Then you'll find Bath quite liberating, I suspect. Here, ideas matter more than ancestry, and curiosity is valued more highly than conformity." As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself drawn into conversations that challenged her in ways she had never experienced. Dr. Reed spoke passionately about his work with patients from all social classes, his research into new medical treatments, and his belief that education and opportunity should be available to all people, regardless of their birth circumstances. His ideas were radical by London standards, but they resonated with something deep within Catherine that she had never been encouraged to explore. "Dr. Reed," Catherine said during a quiet moment when they found themselves somewhat apart from the main group, "might I ask what drew you to medicine? It seems a demanding profession, and one that must often bring you into contact with difficult circumstances." "The opportunity to make a genuine difference in people's lives," Dr. Reed replied without hesitation. "In London, I suspect one's value is often measured by one's ability to maintain appearances and navigate social complexities. In medicine, success is measured by whether a patient recovers, whether a treatment proves effective, whether suffering is alleviated. It's remarkably clarifying to work in a field where results matter more than reputation." Catherine found herself thinking about Dr. Reed's words long after the evening had ended. For the first time in her life, she was encountering people who had chosen their paths based on passion and purpose rather than obligation and expectation. The contrast with her own carefully circumscribed existence was both illuminating and somewhat painful. "You seem thoughtful this morning," Aunt Agatha observed as they took their customary walk through the city's elegant streets. "I trust last evening's gathering provided some interesting conversation." "Indeed it did," Catherine replied. "Dr. Reed, in particular, seems to possess a clarity of purpose that I find enviable." Aunt Agatha's knowing smile suggested she had observed more than Catherine realized. "Elias is a remarkable young man. He's built his practice on merit rather than connections, and his patients include everyone from Bath's wealthiest residents to the poorest families in the surrounding countryside. He treats them all with equal dedication. "How unusual," Catherine murmured, though she realized as she spoke that what seemed unusual was actually how things should be. "Perhaps," Aunt Agatha said, "but it's also how one builds a life of genuine meaning. Catherine, my dear, you've spent your entire existence preparing to fulfill other people's expectations. Have you ever considered what you might accomplish if you were free to pursue your own interests and inclinations?" The question lingered in Catherine's mind as they continued their walk, passing the elegant shops and coffee houses where Bath's residents gathered to exchange ideas and debate the issues of the day. For the first time since the catastrophic ball, Catherine found herself wondering whether Sterling's rejection might actually have been a blessing in disguise, a liberation from a future that would have required her to suppress everything that made her uniquely herself. But what would it mean to build a life based on her own choices rather than her family's expectations? And did she possess the courage to pursue such an unprecedented path? 3 months in Bath had transformed Catherine in ways that would have been unimaginable during her sheltered existence at Whitmore Hall. The young woman, who had once measured her worth by her ability to execute a perfect curtsy and engage in meaningless pleasantries, had discovered within herself a sharp intellect and a passionate curiosity about the world beyond drawing-room conversations. Under Aunt Agatha's gentle guidance, she had begun reading works of philosophy and natural science, attending lectures on subjects ranging from astronomy to social reform, and participating in discussions that challenged her to form and defend her own opinions. Dr. Elias Reed had become a frequent visitor to Aunt Agatha's salon, and Catherine found herself looking forward to their conversations with an anticipation that had nothing to do with social obligation and everything to do with genuine intellectual stimulation. Unlike the calculated courtship she had experienced with Sterling, her growing friendship with Dr. Reed felt natural and unforced, built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than family alliances and financial considerations. "Lady Catherine," Dr. Reed said one afternoon as they walked through Bath's botanical gardens, "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I've been wondering about your plans for the future. Surely you don't intend to remain in Bath indefinitely?" Catherine paused beside a bed of early roses, their delicate petals reminding her of the carefully cultivated beauty that had once defined her entire existence. "I confess I'm uncertain about what the future holds," she replied honestly. "My family expects me to return to London eventually, but I find myself reluctant to resume a life that now seems insufficient." "Insufficient in what way?" Dr. Reed asked, his tone encouraging rather than judgmental. "In London, I was valued primarily for my appearance and my ability to enhance my family's social standing through an advantageous marriage," Catherine explained. "Here, I've discovered that I have thoughts and opinions worth expressing, interests worth pursuing, and perhaps even abilities worth developing. The prospect of returning to a world where those aspects of myself would be considered irrelevant or even inappropriate feels rather like voluntarily entering a prison." Dr. Reed's expression grew thoughtful as he considered her words. "Have you discussed these feelings with your aunt? She seems remarkably perceptive about such matters." "Aunt Agatha has been wonderfully supportive," Catherine said, "but I suspect she understands better than anyone how difficult it would be for me to maintain my independence while remaining dependent on my family's financial support. Unmarried ladies of my background have few options for supporting themselves, and even fewer for pursuing meaningful work." "That's true," Dr. Reed acknowledged, "though perhaps not as universally true as it once was. I've encountered several remarkable women who have found ways to create lives of purpose and independence. Miss Elizabeth Hartwell, for instance, has established a school for young ladies that emphasizes intellectual development rather than merely social accomplishments. Mrs. Sarah Pemberton has become one of Bath's most respected botanical illustrators, supporting herself through her artistic work. It requires courage and determination, but it's not impossible. Catherine felt a flutter of excitement at the possibility that such alternatives might exist, though she also recognized the enormous challenges involved in pursuing such an unconventional path. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure approaching along the garden path, a figure that made her heart sink with a mixture of dread and resignation. Victoria Whitmore, accompanied by their mother's lady's maid as a chaperone, was walking toward them with the determined stride of someone on a mission. Catherine's younger sister looked as beautiful as ever, her golden hair perfectly arranged beneath a fashionable bonnet and her travelling dress cut in the latest London style. But there was something in her expression, a combination of excitement and calculation, that immediately put Catherine on guard. "Catherine, darling!" Victoria called out as she approached, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness that Catherine had learned to distrust. "What a delightful surprise to find you here. And Dr. Reed, how pleasant to see you again." Catherine felt Dr. Reed stiffen slightly beside her, though his response was perfectly polite. "Lady Victoria, welcome to Bath. I trust your journey from London was comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you," Victoria replied, though her attention was clearly focused on Catherine. "Sister dear, you look wonderfully well. The Bath air seems to agree with you remarkably." "Thank you, Victoria," Catherine said carefully. "I wasn't expecting you. Is everything well at home?" Victoria's smile faltered slightly, revealing a hint of the anxiety beneath her polished exterior. "Actually, Catherine, I've come with rather important news. News that I felt you should hear from family rather than through other channels." Catherine felt a familiar chill of apprehension. "What sort of news?" "Perhaps we should find somewhere more private to talk," Victoria suggested, glancing meaningfully at Dr. Reed. "Family matters, you understand." Dr. Reed immediately stepped back with the courtesy of a gentleman who understood social boundaries. "Of course. Lady Catherine, I hope we might continue our conversation at another time. Lady Victoria, I hope you enjoy your stay in Bath." As Dr. Reed departed, Catherine found herself alone with her sister for the first time since the catastrophic ball. Victoria waited until he was well out of earshot before speaking, her artificial sweetness replaced by an urgency that seemed genuine. "Catherine, I need to tell you something about Sterling. About the Duke of Ravenshollow. Something that changes everything about what happened that night." Catherine felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What do you mean?" Victoria glanced around to ensure they were truly alone before continuing in a lowered voice. "After you left for Bath, I began to feel terrible about my role in what happened. I couldn't stop thinking about that ring and what it might mean. So I decided to investigate." "Investigate how?" "I spoke with Mother's lady's maid, Mrs. Henderson. She's been with our family for nearly 30 years, and she remembers things that others might prefer to forget." Victoria paused, as if gathering courage for what she was about to reveal. "Catherine, that ring, Mother's ring, it wasn't a gift from an admirer before her marriage to Father." Catherine felt the world shift slightly around her. Then what was it? It was a gift from Sterling's father, the previous Duke of Ravenshollow. Victoria's words came out in a rush, as if she needed to speak them quickly before losing her nerve. "Mrs. Henderson remembers because she was the one who helped Mother hide it when Father began courting her. Apparently the old Duke had pursued Mother quite aggressively before her marriage, and the ring was his attempt to secure her affections." The implications of Victoria's revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. "Are you saying that Sterling knew about this connection when he proposed to me?" "I believe so," Victoria said miserably. "Mrs. Henderson thinks the old Duke may have told Sterling about Mother before his death, perhaps as a warning about our family's suitability. When I mentioned the ring that night, Sterling realized that his secret was about to be exposed. Catherine felt a surge of anger unlike anything she had ever experienced. The humiliation of that evening had been devastating enough, but to learn that it had been orchestrated by someone who had known all along about the potential scandal made it infinitely worse. "But Catherine," Victoria continued, her voice growing more urgent, "that's not the most important part. Sterling has been telling people in London that he discovered irregularities in our family's background that made the marriage impossible. He's been suggesting that there are questions about our legitimacy, our financial stability, even our moral character." Catherine's anger transformed into something colder and more focused. "He's been deliberately destroying our reputation to justify his own behavior." "Exactly, and it's working. Several families have already withdrawn invitations, and father's business associates are beginning to distance themselves from any connection with our family. If something isn't done soon, we'll be completely ostracized from society." Catherine found herself thinking with a clarity that surprised her. The months in Bath had given her perspective on the true value of London society's approval, but she also understood that her family's reputation affected more than just social standing. It influenced business relationships, political alliances, and the future prospects of everyone connected to the Whitmore name. "What do you propose we do?" Catherine asked. Victoria's expression grew calculating in a way that reminded Catherine uncomfortably of their mother. "I think you should return to London, not to hide or to apologize, but to show society that you're not ashamed of anything that happened, and I think you should do it in a way that makes Sterling's behavior look as petty and vindictive as it actually was." "How?" "The Pemberton Charity Gala is next month. It's the most important social event of the late spring season, and everyone who matters will be there. If you were to attend, looking absolutely radiant and completely confident, it would send a message that you're not defeated by Sterling's rejection." Catherine considered the proposal, recognizing both its potential effectiveness and its considerable risks. "And if Sterling is there as well? Then you'll have the opportunity to show everyone the difference between someone who acts with dignity and someone who behaves like a petulant child," Victoria replied. "Catherine, you've changed during your time here. You're stronger, more confident, more substantial than you were before. People will see that, and they'll draw their own conclusions about who was truly at fault for what happened." As they walked back toward Aunt Agatha's house, Catherine found herself considering Victoria's proposal with a mixture of trepidation and growing determination. The idea of returning to London and facing the gossips and social predators who had witnessed her humiliation was daunting, but the prospect of allowing Sterling to continue his campaign of character assassination was even more intolerable. That evening, Catherine discussed the situation with Aunt Agatha, who listened with the thoughtful attention she brought to all complex problems. "My dear," Aunt Agatha said when Catherine had finished explaining Victoria's proposal, "the question isn't whether you should return to London. It's whether you're prepared to return as the person you've become rather than the person you were when you left." "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you go back to London and attempt to resume your old role, the dutiful daughter seeking society's approval, you'll be fighting Sterling's campaign on his terms, using weapons he's already proven he can wield more effectively than you. But if you return as the intelligent, independent woman you've discovered yourself to be, you'll be playing an entirely different game." Catherine felt a spark of understanding. "You're suggesting I shouldn't try to defend my old reputation, but rather establish a new one?" "Precisely. Let Sterling and his allies whisper about ancient scandals and imagined improprieties. You can demonstrate through your actions and your choices that you're someone worth knowing and respecting, regardless of whatever gossip may surround your family's past." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Aunt Agatha's house. Dr. Reed arrived earlier than usual, carrying a letter that he handed to Catherine with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Lady Catherine," he said, I hope you'll forgive the early hour, but I received some news last night that I thought might interest you. I've been offered a position establishing a new medical practice in London, one that would focus on providing care to patients regardless of their ability to pay. The position would allow me to continue my research while also making a meaningful contribution to public health. Catherine felt her heart skip as she realized the implications of his announcement. "You're moving to London?" "I'm considering it," Dr. Reed replied carefully. "The opportunity is remarkable, and the work would be exactly the sort of meaningful practice I've always hoped to establish. But I confess that my decision might be influenced by personal considerations, as well as professional ones." Their eyes met, and Catherine felt a flutter of possibility that had nothing to do with family expectations or social obligations. For the first time since Sterling's rejection, she found herself contemplating a future that might include not just independence and purpose, but also genuine affection and partnership. "Dr. Reed," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart, "I believe I may be returning to London myself quite soon. Perhaps we might continue our conversations there." His smile was answer enough, and Catherine realized that her return to London would represent not a retreat to her old life, but an advance towards something entirely new and infinitely more promising. But first, she would need to face Sterling Blackwood and demonstrate to London society that she was no longer the naive young woman who could be publicly humiliated and discarded. The question was whether she possessed the courage to transform her greatest defeat into her most decisive victory. The journey back to London felt like traveling between two different worlds. As Catherine's carriage rolled through the familiar countryside, approaching the capital, she found herself observing details that had escaped her notice during her previous travels. The way tenant farmers worked their fields with quiet dignity, the bustling energy of market towns, where merchants and customers engaged in spirited negotiations, the coaching inns where people from vastly different backgrounds shared meals and conversation with easy familiarity. Her months in Bath had opened her eyes to possibilities that existed beyond the rigid hierarchies of aristocratic society, and she was determined not to lose that broader perspective even as she prepared to re-enter London's complex social battlefield. Aunt Agatha had insisted on accompanying Catherine for the return journey, ostensibly to attend the Pemberton Charity Gala herself, but actually to provide moral support during what promised to be a challenging reintegration into London society. Dr. Reed had departed for London a week earlier to begin establishing his new practice, but not before a private conversation with Catherine that had left her feeling both nervous and exhilarated about the possibilities their renewed acquaintance might hold. "Remember, my dear," Aunt Agatha said, as their carriage navigated London's increasingly crowded streets, "you're not returning as a supplicant seeking forgiveness or approval. You're returning as a woman who has discovered her own worth and chosen her own path. That confidence will be your greatest asset in whatever confrontations may await." Whitmore Hall appeared unchanged from the outside, its imposing facade still projecting the same aura of established wealth and social prominence that had defined Catherine's childhood. But as she stepped from the carriage and walked through the familiar entrance hall, she realized that her own transformation made everything appear different. The portraits of her ancestors no longer seemed like inspiring examples of family pride, but rather like reminders of lives lived according to other people's expectations. The elaborate furnishings that had once represented security and status now struck her as somewhat excessive, designed more for display than for comfort or genuine beauty. Her reunion with her parents proved to be as complex as she had anticipated. Lord Whitmore greeted her with obvious relief, though she could see the strain that the past months had placed upon him. The social and financial ramifications of Sterling's rejection had indeed been significant, and several important business relationships had suffered as a result of the whispered speculation about the Whitmore family's background and character. "Catherine," her father said as they gathered in his study for a private conversation, "I trust your time in Bath has given you perspective on our current situation. We must proceed very carefully if we hope to restore our family's standing." "I understand the challenges we face, father," Catherine replied, noting how her own voice had gained a confidence that hadn't been there before her departure. "But I believe our approach should focus on demonstrating our family's actual worth rather than defending against unfounded accusations." Lord Whitmore's eyebrows rose slightly at his daughter's directness, but Catherine detected a hint of approval in his expression. "What do you propose?" "I propose that we attend the Pemberton Gala not as people seeking to rehabilitate a damaged reputation, but as members of a family that has nothing to apologize for. Let Sterling and his allies whisper about ancient history and imagined scandals. We'll demonstrate through our actions and our associations that we're people worth knowing and respecting." Her mother's reaction proved more complicated. Lady Margaret had aged visibly during Catherine's absence, the stress of social ostracism and whispered speculation having taken a toll on her usually impeccable composure. When Catherine finally managed a private conversation with her, she found a woman struggling with guilt, fear, and a lifetime of carefully buried secrets. "Catherine, my dear," Lady Margaret said, as they sat in her private sitting room surrounded by the delicate furnishings and personal mementos that had always represented her mother's refined taste. "I fear I owe you an explanation about the ring that caused such difficulties." Catherine waited patiently, recognizing that her mother needed to tell this story in her own way and her own time. "Before my marriage to your father," Lady Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was pursued by several gentlemen whose intentions were not entirely honorable. The previous Duke of Ravenshollow was among them, and he was particularly persistent in his attentions. When I became engaged to your father, the Duke gave me that ring as a farewell gift, I suppose. I should have returned it, but it was so beautiful, and I thought no one would ever know." Catherine felt a surge of sympathy for her mother, recognizing the impossible position young women of their class faced when dealing with unwanted attention from powerful men. "Mother, you have nothing to apologize for. You were young, and you were being pressured by someone who held considerable social power. But don't you see," Lady Margaret continued, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks, "Sterling must have known about his father's interest in me. When Victoria mentioned the ring, he realized that the connection would become public knowledge, and he couldn't bear the thought of being associated with his father's indiscretions." Catherine reached across to take her mother's hand, feeling the trembling that betrayed the older woman's emotional state. "Mother, Sterling's behavior that evening revealed his true character. A man of genuine honor would have handled the situation with discretion and kindness, not with public humiliation and vindictive gossip." Over the following days, as Catherine prepared for the Pemberton Gala, she found herself navigating a complex web of social dynamics that had shifted significantly during her absence. Some of London's elite families had indeed distanced themselves from the Whitmores, influenced by Sterling's campaign of whispered insinuations and calculated social pressure. But others, particularly those who had witnessed Sterling's behavior at the engagement ball, seemed inclined to view the situation with more nuance and sympathy. Lady Pemberton herself, the formidable dowager who organized London's most prestigious charity events, had made a point of personally confirming the Whitmore family's invitation to the gala. Her message, delivered through her private secretary, had been brief but significant. The Pemberton family values character over gossip and substance over speculation. Catherine's preparation for the gala became an exercise in strategic thinking that would have impressed any military commander. With Aunt Agatha's guidance, she selected a gown that struck the perfect balance between elegance and restraint, a deep sapphire silk that complemented her coloring without appearing ostentatious, cut in a style that was fashionable but not attention-seeking. Her jewelry was limited to her grandmother's pearls, a choice that emphasized her family's established heritage while avoiding any appearance of defensive display. More importantly, Catherine spent considerable time preparing mentally for the various encounters she might face. She practiced responses to potential provocations, rehearsed gracious acknowledgements of support, and developed strategies for redirecting conversations away from gossip and toward more substantive topics. Aunt Agatha proved invaluable in this preparation, drawing on her decades of experience navigating London's social complexities. Remember, Aunt Agatha advised as they reviewed potential scenarios, your goal isn't to defeat Sterling in some sort of public confrontation. Your goal is to demonstrate that you're someone worth knowing and respecting, regardless of whatever ancient history may surround your family. Let your character speak for itself. The evening of the Pemberton Gala arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed for grand social occasions. As Catherine's carriage approached the Pemberton mansion, she could see the elaborate preparations that had transformed the already impressive residence into a glittering showcase of London's wealth and influence. Hundreds of candles illuminated the facade, while liveried footmen directed an endless stream of carriages bearing the crests of England's most prominent families. Catherine felt her heart racing as she stepped from her carriage. But it was excitement rather than anxiety that quickened her pulse. For the first time in her life, she was attending a major social event, not as someone seeking approval or fulfilling expectations, but as someone confident in her own worth and clear about her own values. The receiving line moved with the practiced efficiency of a well-orchestrated military operation, each guest spending precisely the appropriate amount of time exchanging pleasantries with Lord and Lady Pemberton before moving into the main ballroom. When Catherine's turn arrived, Lady Pemberton's greeting was warm and unmistakably supportive. "Lady Catherine," the elderly dowager said, her voice carrying clearly enough for nearby guests to hear, "how delightful to see you looking so well. I trust your time in Bath was restorative. The intellectual climate there is quite stimulating, I'm told." "Indeed it was, Lady Pemberton," Catherine replied with genuine warmth. "I found the opportunity to engage with new ideas and different perspectives quite enlightening." "Excellent. I do hope you'll share some of those perspectives with our other guests this evening. Fresh thinking is always welcome in these gatherings." As Catherine moved into the ballroom, she was immediately struck by the subtle but unmistakable shift in how people responded to her presence. Some guests approached with obvious curiosity, eager to assess how she had weathered the scandal and speculation. Others maintained a careful distance, unwilling to risk association with someone whose social standing remained uncertain. But a surprising number seemed genuinely pleased to see her, offering warm greetings that suggested their opinion of her had actually improved as a result of how she had handled the crisis. It was during one such conversation with Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, the educator Dr. Reed had mentioned, that Catherine first spotted Sterling across the crowded ballroom. He was holding court near the fireplace, surrounded by a circle of admirers that included several young ladies whose families were clearly hoping to attract his attention now that his engagement to Catherine had been dissolved. Even from a distance, Catherine could see that he appeared confident and untroubled by any lingering consequences from his behavior at her engagement ball. "Lady Catherine," Mrs. Hartwell was saying, "I understand you've been spending time in Bath with your great-aunt. Mrs. Ashford has quite a reputation as an intellectual hostess. I imagine you found the conversation there quite different from what one typically encounters in London drawing rooms." "Very different indeed," Catherine replied, forcing herself to focus on the conversation rather than on Sterling's presence. "I discovered that I have interests and opinions I had never been encouraged to explore. It was quite liberating." "How wonderful! You know, I'm always looking for young ladies who might be interested in contributing to our educational initiatives. We're developing new approaches to female education that emphasize intellectual development rather than merely social accomplishments. Perhaps you might consider visiting our school sometime." Catherine felt a flutter of genuine excitement at the possibility. "I would be very interested in learning more about your work, Mrs. Hartwell." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Reed, who approached with the easy confidence of someone who belonged wherever his work and interests took him. Catherine felt her heart skip as she saw him, noting how his serious features were transformed by the smile that appeared when their eyes met. "Lady Catherine," Dr. Reed said, offering a bow that was respectful without being obsequious, "how pleasant to see you again. Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you're well." "Quite well, Dr. Reed," Mrs. Hartwell replied with obvious approval. "I was just telling Lady Catherine about our educational initiatives. I believe she might find them interesting." "I'm certain she would," Dr. Reed agreed, his gaze remaining fixed on Catherine's face. "Lady Catherine has a remarkable intellect and a genuine curiosity about the world beyond conventional social boundaries." Catherine felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, recognizing that this was perhaps the first time in her life that someone had publicly praised her for qualities other than her appearance or her family connections. The moment was interrupted, however, by a commotion near the fireplace that drew everyone's attention. Sterling had apparently been holding forth about something that had attracted a larger audience than usual, and his voice was beginning to carry across the ballroom with the kind of volume that suggested he had been sampling the evening's wine selection rather liberally. Catherine couldn't make out his exact words, but she could see that several guests were beginning to look uncomfortable with whatever he was saying. "Perhaps, Dr. Reed said quietly, we should move to a different part of the room." But before Catherine could respond, Sterling's voice rose to a level that made his words clearly audible throughout the ballroom. "And I can assure you all that my decision to withdraw from that particular engagement was based on information that would shock anyone who values propriety and moral character." The ballroom fell silent, with the kind of sudden hush that indicated everyone present understood they were witnessing something significant. Catherine felt every eye in the room turn toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to this public provocation. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Catherine stood perfectly still, feeling the weight of hundreds of gazes and the pressure of a decision that would define not only this evening, but potentially the rest of her life. She could retreat, allowing Sterling's insinuations to stand unchallenged. She could respond with anger, creating the kind of dramatic scene that would provide gossip for months to come. Or she could choose a third option, one that would require every ounce of the confidence and self-possession she had developed during her months in Bath. Taking a deep breath, Catherine walked directly toward Sterling with the measured pace of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. The crowd parted before her like water, creating a clear path to the fireplace where Sterling stood with his circle of admirers. As she approached, she could see uncertainty beginning to replace the confidence in his expression, as if he was suddenly realizing that his public provocation might not produce the reaction he had anticipated. When she reached the fireplace, Catherine stopped directly in front of Sterling and spoke in a voice that was clear, calm, and perfectly audible throughout the silent ballroom. "Your Grace," she said, with a curtsy that was precisely correct without being deferential, "I couldn't help but overhear your comments about propriety and moral character. As someone who has had the opportunity to observe your behavior quite closely, I find myself curious about your particular expertise in those areas." The silence that followed was so complete that Catherine could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Sterling's face had gone pale, and she could see his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to formulate a response. "Lady Catherine," he finally managed, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone, "I'm surprised to see you here this evening. I had understood that you were indisposed." Not at all, Catherine replied with a smile that was perfectly pleasant and utterly devastating. I've been in Bath, expanding my education and my perspective on what constitutes a life worth living. It's been quite enlightening. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. I've learned, for instance, that true character is revealed not by one's ability to make accusations from a safe distance, but by one's willingness to act with honor and integrity even when faced with difficult circumstances. Sterling's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. Around them, Catherine could sense the crowd's growing appreciation for the skill with which she was handling the confrontation. I've also learned, Catherine continued, her voice remaining perfectly calm and reasonable, that the most valuable relationships are built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than on calculations of social advantage or financial benefit. It's a lesson I'm grateful to have learned before making any permanent commitments that might have proven regrettable. Daddy. With that final observation, Catherine offered another perfectly correct curtsy and turned to walk away, leaving Sterling standing speechless before an audience that was now looking at him with expressions ranging from amusement to outright disapproval. As she rejoined Dr. Reed and Mrs. Hartwell, Catherine felt a surge of exhilaration unlike anything she had ever experienced. For the first time in her life, she had stood up for herself not as a dutiful daughter or a prospective bride, but as an independent woman, confident in her own worth and unafraid to defend her own honor. Magnificently done, Dr. Reed murmured as the ballroom gradually returned to its normal level of conversation. I don't believe His Grace will be making any more public pronouncements about your family's character. Catherine smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. I hope not. But if he does, I find I'm no longer particularly concerned about it. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, introductions and conversations that felt more genuine and substantial than any social interactions Catherine had experienced in her previous life. Word of her confrontation with Sterling spread quickly through the ballroom, and the consensus seemed to be that she had handled herself with remarkable grace and dignity under extremely challenging circumstances. As the evening drew to a close, Dr. Reed approached Catherine with an expression that combined nervousness with determination. Lady Catherine, he said, I wonder if I might have a word with you privately. There's something I've been hoping to discuss. Catherine felt her heart begin to race as she recognized the significance of his request. Of course, Dr. Reed. They found a quiet alcove overlooking Lady Pemberton's garden, where the moonlight created patterns of silver and shadow among the carefully tended flower beds. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, both seeming to understand that they were approaching a moment that would define their future relationship. Catherine, Doctor, Reed said, using her given name for the first time, I hope you know how much I've come to admire not only your intelligence and your character, but also your courage in choosing to live according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the sincerity in his voice and the recognition that he truly saw and valued who she had become. I've been offered the opportunity to establish a practice that would allow me to make a meaningful contribution to public health, while also supporting myself comfortably, he continued. It's the kind of work I've always dreamed of doing, but I find myself hoping that I might share that future with someone who understands the value of a life lived in service to something larger than oneself. Catherine looked into his earnest brown eyes and saw reflected there a future that was entirely different from anything she had ever imagined, a future built on partnership rather than submission, on shared values rather than social obligations, on love rather than arrangement. Elias, she said softly, I can think of nothing I would value more than the opportunity to build such a life together. His smile was radiant as he took her hands in his, and Catherine realized that Sterling's rejection, devastating though it had seemed at the time, had actually been the beginning of her journey toward a future that was authentically her own. But as they stood together in the moonlit garden, both understood that choosing such an unconventional path would require continued courage and determination. Would London society accept their partnership, and could they build a life together that honored both their individual aspirations and their shared commitment to making a meaningful difference in the world? 6 months after the Pemberton Gala, Catherine stood at the window of her new home in Bloomsbury, watching the morning bustle of a London neighbourhood that bore little resemblance to the rarefied atmosphere of Mayfair, where she had spent her youth. The modest but elegant townhouse that she now shared with her husband, Dr. Elias Reed, occupied a tree-lined street where physicians, barristers, successful merchants, and independent women of letters lived side by side in a community defined more by intellectual curiosity and professional accomplishment than by ancient bloodlines or inherited wealth. The transformation of her life still sometimes struck Catherine as so complete that she felt as though she were living in someone else's story. The young woman, who had once measured her worth by her ability to execute a perfect curtsy and make advantageous conversation, had become Mrs. Catherine Reed, a woman who spent her mornings assisting her husband in his medical practice and her afternoons developing educational curricula for Mrs. Hartwell's progressive school for young ladies. Their wedding, held in the intimate chapel of St. George's, Hanover Square, had been a deliberate rejection of the elaborate social spectacle that her engagement to Sterling would have produced. Instead of hundreds of guests representing London's most powerful families, Catherine and Elias had chosen to celebrate their union with a small gathering of people whose presence reflected their shared values rather than their social obligations. Aunt Agatha had served as Catherine's primary attendant, while Dr. Reed's closest friend from his medical training had stood as his witness. Lord and Lady Whitmore had attended, their initial reservations about their daughter's unconventional choice gradually giving way to genuine respect for their new son-in-law's character and accomplishments. The absence of certain expected guests had been as significant as the presence of those who attended. Sterling had not been invited naturally, though Catherine had heard through the inevitable social gossip that he had recently become engaged to a young lady whose family's financial difficulties made them grateful for any aristocratic connection, regardless of the circumstances. Victoria had attended the wedding, though her relationship with Catherine remained complicated by guilt over her role in the original scandal and envy over her sister's apparent happiness in defying conventional expectations. "Mrs. Reed," called Sarah, who had chosen to remain in Catherine's service despite the significant change in circumstances. "Dr. Reed asked me to remind you that Mrs. Patterson is expected at 10 o'clock for her consultation." Catherine smiled at the title that still felt wonderfully new and chosen rather than inherited. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be down directly." The ground floor of their home had been converted into a medical practice that reflected Elias's commitment to providing care regardless of his patient's ability to pay. The waiting room was furnished with comfortable chairs and tables laden with books and periodicals, creating an atmosphere that was welcoming rather than intimidating. Catherine had discovered that her years of managing household staff and organizing social events had prepared her remarkably well for the administrative demands of a medical practice, though the work felt infinitely more meaningful than arranging dinner parties or managing calling schedules. Mrs. Patterson, a seamstress whose husband had been injured in a factory accident, represented the kind of patient who would never have been able to afford treatment from a fashionable Harley Street physician. Catherine had been working with her for several weeks, helping to coordinate her husband's medical care while also connecting her with charitable organizations that could provide temporary financial assistance during his recovery. "Mrs. Reed," Mrs. Patterson said, as Catherine greeted her in the waiting room, "I can't tell you how grateful we are for everything you and the doctor have done. My husband is walking again, and the charitable society you recommended has helped us keep our lodgings." Catherine felt the familiar warmth that came from knowing her work made a genuine difference in people's lives. "I'm so pleased to hear about your husband's progress, Mrs. Patterson. Dr. Reed will want to examine him again next week to ensure his recovery continues as expected." As the morning progressed, Catherine found herself reflecting on how completely her understanding of purpose and fulfillment had changed. In her previous life, success had been measured by social invitations received, advantageous connections made, and the approval of people whose opinions she now realized had been based on superficial considerations. Now, success meant helping Mrs. Patterson navigate the complex process of obtaining charitable assistance, or working with Mrs. Hartwell to develop teaching methods that would encourage young ladies to think critically rather than merely memorize social conventions. The afternoon brought a different kind of satisfaction as Catherine made her way to Mrs. Hartwell's school in nearby Russell Square. The institution, housed in a converted mansion that had been specifically redesigned for educational purposes, represented everything that Catherine's own education had lacked. Instead of focusing exclusively on accomplishments designed to attract suitable husbands, Mrs. Hartwell's curriculum emphasized mathematics, natural philosophy, literature, history, and modern languages, taught with the same rigor typically reserved for young gentlemen's education. "Mrs. Reed," Mrs. Hartwell said, as Catherine arrived for their weekly planning meeting, "I've been reviewing the essays your students submitted on the topic of social reform. Their thinking is remarkably sophisticated for young ladies who have been taught to avoid expressing strong opinions." Catherine felt a surge of pride in her students, young women aged 16 to 20, whose families had chosen Mrs. Hartwell's school specifically because they wanted their daughters to develop intellectual independence alongside social graces. "I've found that they're eager to engage with complex ideas once they realize their opinions are valued and respected." Indeed, Miss Charlotte Pemberton's essay on the need for improved working conditions in textile factories was particularly impressive. She's clearly been thinking deeply about the connections between economic policy and human welfare. Catherine smiled, remembering her own surprise at discovering how much she enjoyed intellectual challenges when they were presented as opportunities for growth rather than tests of adequacy. Miss Pemberton has expressed interest in visiting some of the charitable organizations that work with factory workers. I thought we might arrange an educational excursion that would allow our students to observe social reform efforts firsthand. Excellent idea. Practical experience will make their theoretical understanding much more meaningful. As they discussed curriculum development and student progress, Catherine found herself thinking about the contrast between her current work and the empty social obligations that had once filled her days. Teaching young women to think critically about the world around them felt like a form of rebellion against the system that had tried to limit her own intellectual development, and she took deep satisfaction in knowing that her students would enter adulthood with tools for independent thinking that she had been forced to discover for herself. The late afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the Reed household. Catherine returned from the school to find Victoria waiting in the drawing room, her elegant appearance somewhat at odds with the comfortable but unpretentious furnishings that Catherine and Elias had chosen for their home. "Victoria?" Catherine said, genuinely pleased to see her sister despite their complicated relationship. "What a lovely surprise. I hope you're well." "Quite well, thank you," Victoria replied, though Catherine detected an underlying tension in her manner. "Catherine, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I've come to ask for your advice about something rather important." Catherine settled into the chair across from her sister, noting how Victoria's usual confidence seemed somewhat diminished. "Of course. What's troubling you?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her hands, as if gathering courage for what she needed to say. "I've received a proposal of marriage from Lord Ashford. He's quite wealthy, well-connected, and everything that mother and father would consider an ideal match." Catherine waited patiently, sensing that her sister's concerns went deeper than simple pre-wedding nerves. "But Catherine," Victoria continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "I find myself wondering whether accepting his proposal would be the right choice for the right reasons, or simply the expected choice for conventional reasons." Catherine felt a surge of sympathy for her sister, recognizing the same questions that had once tormented her own thoughts about Sterling. "What does your heart tell you about Lord Ashford?" "That's just it. I'm not certain I know what my heart tells me about anything anymore. Watching you build this life with Dr. Reed, seeing how happy you are in work that matters to you, it's made me question whether I've ever really considered what I want from life beyond social approval and financial security." Catherine reached across to take her sister's hand, feeling the trembling that betrayed Victoria's emotional turmoil. "Victoria, there's nothing wrong with wanting security and social acceptance. But there's also nothing wrong with wanting more than that, or with taking time to discover what more might mean for you. But how does one discover such things? You had the advantage of that terrible scandal forcing you to reconsider your path. I don't have such dramatic circumstances to provide clarity." Catherine smiled at her sister's characteristically direct assessment of the situation. "You don't need a scandal to give yourself permission to think deeply about what kind of life would make you truly happy. You could spend time with people whose work interests you, read books that challenge your thinking, travel to places that broaden your perspective. The important thing is to make your choice based on genuine self-knowledge rather than on what others expect of you." Victoria's expression grew thoughtful as she considered Catherine's words. "Do you think Mother and Father would understand if I asked for time to consider Lord Ashford's proposal more carefully? I think they've learned from recent experience that forcing a marriage for conventional reasons can have unexpected consequences," Catherine replied diplomatically. "And I think they've also seen that unconventional choices can sometimes lead to genuine happiness." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elias, who greeted Victoria with the warm courtesy that had made him popular among all members of Catherine's family, despite their initial reservations about his background. "Lady Victoria," he said, "how pleasant to see you. I hope you'll stay for dinner. Catherine has been experimenting with some recipes she learned from our cook, and I can attest that the results are quite impressive." Victoria's surprise at the invitation was evident, though she accepted with apparent pleasure. Catherine realized that her sister had probably never experienced the kind of informal family dinner that had become routine in the Reed household, where conversation flowed freely among topics ranging from medical cases to educational theory to current political developments. As the evening progressed, Catherine watched Victoria gradually relax into the easy atmosphere of their home. The younger woman seemed particularly intrigued by Elias's stories about his work with patients from all social classes, and she asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of providing medical care to people who couldn't afford traditional physicians' fees. "Dr. Reed," Victoria said during a pause in the conversation, "I hope you won't think me impertinent, but I'm curious about how you decided to establish this particular kind of practice. Surely there were more conventional opportunities available to someone with your training." Elias smiled, clearly pleased by her genuine interest. "There were indeed more conventional opportunities, Lady Victoria, but I found that conventional practice often meant treating symptoms of wealth and leisure rather than addressing genuine medical needs. Here, I have the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives while also advancing medical knowledge through research into conditions that affect working people." "How fascinating! And you find this work more satisfying than a traditional practice would be?" "Immeasurably more satisfying," Elias replied without hesitation. "Success is measured by whether patients recover and return to productive lives, not by whether one's clientele includes the most fashionable names in society." Catherine watched her sister absorb this perspective, recognizing the same process of expanding awareness that she had experienced during her own time in Bath. Victoria was beginning to understand that there were ways of measuring success and fulfillment that had nothing to do with social status or conventional expectations. After Victoria departed, Catherine and Elias settled into their evening routine of reading and quiet conversation before the fireplace. It was during these peaceful moments that Catherine most fully appreciated the life they had built together, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection rather than on social obligation or financial calculation. "Elias," Catherine said, as she looked up from the medical journal she'd been reading, "do you ever regret choosing such an unconventional path? Sometimes I wonder whether we've made life more difficult for ourselves than it needed to be." Elias set aside his own reading and moved to sit beside her on the sofa, taking her hand in his with the gentle touch that never failed to make her feel cherished and valued. "Catherine, my love," he said, "I can honestly say that I've never been happier or more fulfilled than I am in this life we've created together. Yes, we've chosen a path that requires more effort and involves more uncertainty than following conventional expectations would have demanded. But we've also chosen a path that allows us to be authentically ourselves while making a meaningful contribution to the world around us." Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes as she considered how dramatically her understanding of happiness had changed. "Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if I had married Sterling, and I realize that I would have spent decades trying to be someone I'm not in order to fulfill someone else's vision of what I should be. And instead," Elias said, his voice warm with affection, "you've become someone who inspires young women to think for themselves, who helps families navigate medical crises, and who has created a home where ideas and compassion matter more than social conventions." As they sat together in the comfortable silence of their shared contentment, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Sterling's public rejection, devastating though it had seemed at the time, had actually been the catalyst for discovering her own strength, her own values, and her own capacity for creating a meaningful life. The humiliation that had once felt like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of her real life. The next morning brought news that provided a satisfying epilogue to the drama that had begun with Victoria's innocent observation about their mother's ring. Sarah delivered the information with the barely concealed satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice being served. "Mrs. Reed," Sarah said, as she brought Catherine's morning correspondence, "I thought you might be interested to know that there's been quite a bit of talk in the servants' quarters about His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshollow." Catherine looked up from her breakfast with mild curiosity. "Oh, what sort of talk?" "Well, it seems that his new bride has proven to be rather more spirited than he anticipated. Lady Ravenshollow has been making quite a name for herself by expressing strong opinions about her husband's business practices and social attitudes. The staff at Ravenshollow House report that there are frequent discussions between their graces about how the household should be managed." Catherine couldn't suppress a smile at the image of Sterling discovering that his new wife possessed the kind of independent spirit that he had clearly hoped to avoid. "How interesting. I hope Lady Ravenshollow is finding her new position educational." "Indeed, ma'am. And there's more. It seems that Lady Ravenshollow has been asking pointed questions about the family's financial arrangements, and she's discovered some irregularities in how the estate has been managed. There's talk that she's insisted on bringing in independent auditors to review the books." Catherine felt a surge of admiration for the new Duchess of Ravenshollow, whoever she might be. It seemed that Sterling's attempt to find a more compliant wife had backfired spectacularly, leaving him married to someone who was proving even more challenging to his authority than Catherine would ever have been. "Well," Catherine said, returning to her correspondence with a sense of cosmic justice having been served, "I suppose we all eventually find exactly what we deserve." As the months continued to pass, Catherine found herself increasingly confident that she and Elias had indeed found what they deserved, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine love. Their work continued to expand and evolve, with Elias's medical practice gaining recognition for its innovative approaches to public health, and Catherine's educational initiatives attracting attention from progressive thinkers across London. Victoria eventually decided to decline Lord Ashford's proposal, choosing instead to spend a year travelling with Aunt Agatha to broaden her perspective before making any permanent commitments. Her letters from the continent revealed a young woman discovering her own interests and capabilities, much as Catherine had done during her transformative months in Bath. The Whitmore family's social standing had not only recovered, but had actually improved as a result of Catherine's dignified handling of the Sterling crisis and her subsequent success in building a meaningful life. Lord Whitmore's business relationships had strengthened as associates recognized that the family possessed the kind of character that could weather adversity with grace, while Lady Margaret had found new purpose in supporting charitable organizations that assisted young women in difficult circumstances. As Catherine stood once again at her window, watching the familiar rhythm of her neighborhood's daily life, she reflected on how completely her understanding of success and happiness had been transformed. The golden cage of her youth had been replaced by a life of chosen purpose, genuine partnership, and meaningful work. She had learned to bloom, not where others planted her, but where she chose to plant herself. The ring that had caused such upheaval now resided in a jewelry box in her dressing room, no longer a symbol of scandal or shame, but rather a reminder of the courage required to choose authenticity over convention. Sometimes, when she looked at it, Catherine felt grateful to Sterling for his rejection, recognizing that his cruelty had inadvertently freed her to discover who she truly was and what she was truly capable of becoming. In the end, she had learned that the most valuable inheritance was not a title or a fortune, but the courage to live according to one's own values and the wisdom to recognize that true happiness came not from meeting other people's expectations, but from exceeding one's own. If this story of courage, transformation, and choosing one's own path has resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a moment when what seemed like a devastating setback actually opened the door to something better? Share your own stories of finding strength in unexpected places, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of resilience, love, and the courage to live authentically. Remember, sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom not in carefully tended gardens, but in the wild spaces where they choose to take root.